Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our program, please welcome to the stage another esteemed member of the CMC Batch of 69, as well as a distinguished leader of the global medical research community and professor of medicine, health sciences, and technology at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Shiv Pila.
Okay, so it's a real pleasure and privilege for me today to introduce someone to you who is one of our special guests tonight. And so this is a person who is a physician, a practicing oncologist, an academic oncologist who's an associate professor at Columbia University. He's a scientist. He's quite a renowned writer. And he's also a gifted musician, okay? And so his story is quite fascinating for most people, and maybe we'll hear more from him in a few minutes. But somewhere along the way, growing up in Delhi, as a young boy, he thought about going out to a college in the US for his undergraduate education. He ended up in Stanford, so this is Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee I'm talking about right now. And he left, went to Stanford in 1989, was clearly an outstanding student. He got many honors. He actually did research with one of the pioneers of, I would say, one of the creators of modern molecular biology at Stanford. He was then awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. He went out to Oxford. And for his DPhil, he worked with, again, a physician scientist, Alan Townsend, who had been one of the people who started the field of understanding how the immune system recognizes stuff out there when you're thinking of any recognition event that leads to clearance of a pathogen or clearance of a tumor. This is where it all started from. When he was doing his DPhil, some of his work addressed issues related to how tumor antigens are recognized by the immune system. And I think that was perhaps the beginning of his, or maybe he'll tell us more about this, his interest in cancer. After his Rhodes, he came to Boston in 1995. He was an MD student in the HST program at Harvard Medical School, which is perhaps the most science-oriented medical school program anywhere. It's a track within Harvard Medical School. And he did more research as a student. He had quite a remarkable MD thesis, which I'll try to get to later on in our conversation. And he then trained after that in internal medicine at Mass General Hospital, continued to do research as a physician at Mass General Hospital. He worked with a renowned cell biologist and a stem cell biologist and an oncologist. That's David Scadden. I made some very important discoveries about stem cells in the bone and the origins of myeloid cancers. And it wasn't a surprise when this young star in the making was recruited by Columbia University as an assistant professor around 2009. So when he was in Boston, I think what we didn't quite realize, there's some other interesting things must have been going on. We now know that this is where he found his wife, who is, has a reputation of her own, very high standing in the field of the arts. And he also was doing something that nobody knew about. Certainly his mentor, who I'm a good friend of, didn't know about. And then in 2010, we saw this amazing book come out, which most of us read, which, within a few months, I was putting it on the list for Harvard undergrads to read for science books. And this is the book, The Emperor of All Maladies. It's one of the most lucidly written books about science and medicine. It brings together a wealth of information. If those of you who haven't read it, you should read it. So it's no surprise that the very next year, he got a Pulitzer Prize. In 2014, I think the government of India awarded him a Padma Shri. And at Columbia, he continued to do some groundbreaking work on stem cells in the bone, and his lab has now taken a very translational turn He's doing some amazing therapies that maybe he'll tell you a little bit about of treating myeloid malignancies. And he also has a large footprint in India. So he actually has been to Vellore, and some of his work, so like you heard about the CAR T cell therapy, some of that comes from his efforts in India. So with that, I want to inform everybody that Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee is the first recipient of the Ida S. Kadir Socratic Leadership Award. I didn't come up with the name, and I'm going to call him up to receive this award. We need a second.
Thank you very much. Okay. Put this down over here.
Yeah, you can put that down. Okay, so this is just a brief conversation. I think we would be, many people in the room who grew up in India would be intrigued to know how somebody with some incredible talents, as you were, gifted as a musician, you had lots of interest in India, and then somewhere along the way, you thought that maybe you want to go into your undergraduate education somewhere in America. And then, I don't know when you actually got interested in medicine and science. I mean, clearly you were interested in science. You must have read widely to have gone to Stanford. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that stage of your life and how your story began. It'll just be of curiosity and interest to everybody.
Sure. I mean, let's make this really interesting because we have just a little bit of time. I'm going to tell you lots of things that I haven't told most people, just for fun. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that when I was growing up as a child, virtually never, no one knows this, but I thought that I would be a musician. And I had no other thing that I had imagined that I would do aside from being a musician. And then a series of important things happened in my life. So in Indian music, in Indian classical music particularly, you go through a training and there are seniors above you and behind you, juniors behind you, seniors in front of you. And it happened to be that I was sandwiched between in my school of music, my gharana, I was sandwiched between, and virtually no one knows this, I was sandwiched between two of the greatest musicians that India would produce. In front of me was Rashid Khan, who unfortunately passed away last year. And behind me is a young musician, Sarfaraz Hussain Khan, who is coming up as a musician. Now, that's a little bit like being a tennis player, and having Roger Federer behind you, and I'm trying to think of the right name.
Rod Laver.
And Rod Laver in front of you. So I quickly realized that I wouldn't be a musician. I switched just in the nick of time and decided that I would in fact go to, pursue the sciences. So I'm an accidental scientist, I have to say. I still think of the time that I wanted to be a full-time musician, but I grew into the sciences accidentally, and that's how I ended up at Stanford.
So, but there's so much passion in your books.
Yes.
It's about the science, passion for medicine, passion for the patients you treated, your family members. So where did this medicine interest really come from? When did it start?
So I came backwards into medicine. I started, and these events are kind of important because they mark sort of timelines in my life. At Stanford, I started off again. I had no idea what I was going to do, and I knocked on Paul Berg's lab. I was the first undergraduate that Paul took into his laboratory. Paul is a very important figure in my life. Paul passed away again. Paul also passed away last year. It's a big moment in my life. But Paul had, for people who don't know Paul's work, Paul had done probably one of the most important experiments of the 20th century in molecular biology, which is that he was already a highly established scientist. But in the middle of all of this, Paul had done an experiment which really revolutionized molecular biology. He had taken 2 pieces of DNA from 2 different organisms, cut them using enzymes, and then pasted them together. It was a cut and paste event. And then created a new piece of DNA which contained DNA from 2 different organisms. People had thought about this as a possibility, but Paul did it as a reality, and showed that in fact, because this molecule was the universal, or contained the universal genetic code, that in fact it was recognized as universal, that it was recognized as if it was one piece. And if introduced back into a bacterium or into the human cell or into a body even, there was nothing that the body said that, oh gosh, that piece is from a bacterium, that's from a virus, that's from a giraffe, that's from a zebra, that's from a human. It all came together as it was one piece of DNA. This technology was called recombinant DNA, as you know very well, but some people may not know. But recombinant DNA, and it began the molecular biology revolution, because all of a sudden you could think about taking one gene from one organism or one human being and putting it into another human being, and then thereby making it a language almost, in that you could translate from one to the other. But Paul did one more thing that was important, and that was very crucial to my life. Paul recognized that the origins of such a technology, recombinant DNA, was the origin, would be the origin of something both miraculous technologically, but also ethically complicated. Because all of a sudden, on one hand, there were biosafety concerns. What if you put a toxic piece, something that made a bacterial or viral toxin, and you put it and you introduce it into a human being? Now you would have that recognized as a piece of normal tissue and extruding the toxin. So there were some biosafety concerns. And then into the very distant future were some ethical concerns. What about gene therapy? How could we replace genes? What would be considered normal? What would be considered pathological? What was the definition or the boundaries of normal versus pathological? And even as early as the late 1970s, early 1980s, Paul began to wrestle with these questions, not only about biosafety, but about these questions about what is normal, what is pathological, where do we draw the lines in recombinant DNA, etc. And he organized 2 conferences. And it's very, very important for us to realize and recall these conferences as we move forward into an era which we'll talk about, of AI and other arenas. He organized 2 conferences, one called Asilomar 1, which was organized in California in a beautiful retreat center called Asilomar. Asilomar 1 was about biosafety. Asilomar 2 was an even more progressive and even more, I would say, a landmark conference, in which he invited, along with David Baltimore, who you and I both know together, and other great scientists, Maxine Singer, he invited a group of not just scientists, but legal scholars, ethical scholars, political scholars, journalists, and an incredible audience of people to come and remark and give feedback about this new technology of genetic engineering, recombinant DNA, that he and others were bringing into the world. And the result of this conference was, and this is really important, the result of this conference was an NIH-imposed moratorium on the use and the movement on research on recombinant DNA before some of these ethical issues could be sorted out. And in fact, these ethical issues were sorted out. Many people commented on them. Some kinds of experiments were forbidden. Some kinds of experiments were considered enabling, and so forth. And the reason I went to Paul as an undergraduate, as a first-year undergraduate with great trepidation, was because I had an instinct that medicine and biology was going to intersect very deeply with ethical and social and cultural concerns. And Paul was the one person, was the northern light for me, and had been and has been and will be the northern light for me, for someone who has been able to really think about not only the scientific, but also the ethical concerns. So there was a very directed way in which I approached Paul. I just didn't go randomly into his office. I wandered into his office with a very directed question about how to think about not just science, but the public impact of science, and what we could or could not do to communicate that impact, and what we could or could not do to have a dialogue with the broader public in common language about the great scientific advances that we were going through. So that's the kind of quick background as to how I got into the field of medicine through really the work of Paul and through science.
Okay, so I have a question to ask you. So I've actually read, he's written 4 books. I haven't read one of them. I've read 3 of them. And they're all brilliant and worth reading. If you just like to read, anything written in the English language, which is so lucid and, helps you understand things, these are amazing books. But I heard when, I look at some of the theses. So he was in a program where every MD student has to write a thesis. He already had a DPhil, but he still had to write an MD thesis. And the rumor I've heard, and I've actually not read his MD thesis, but it got tremendous accolades from the 2 reviewers who talked about it. And I believe it is the longest MD thesis in the history of the HST program. Okay? And someone told me that it's almost like a history of medicine that came out at that time. So I'm wondering whether this is back in around 1997, 98 when you're doing this. Was this the beginning of maybe the Emperor of All Maladies? Or, just think about the story.
Again, no one knows this. I'm glad you dug it up. But yes, that was the beginning of Emperor of All Maladies. So in writing that thesis, my medical MD thesis, I began to ask the question, why does a medical thesis not act as a philosophical document? Why is it merely a quote-unquote scientific document? And what if we spent our time in medicine, in my case, as an MD student, not just thinking about sort of the experiments I'd done or the minor things that I'd done in medicine, but thinking about connecting the work that I'd done with the longer and larger history. And that was the basis. So my MD thesis, my medical thesis, begins with a consideration of the origins of cancer in deep history and continues onwards from there. So when I started writing my thesis, I sat myself down in the library and I said, you know what? I'm going to write a thesis which is going to be very long, obviously, but I'm going to write a thesis in which I'm going to begin to track and understand where I came from, my own story, my own origin story. And that's the beginning of my medical thesis.
Okay, that's a great story. I have to go read that thesis. It's sitting somewhere in our libraries. So maybe I'll end with, so you've done, your lab continues to do exciting work. You have some novel myeloid therapies, immunotherapies that are coming out, which, could help maybe cure acute myeloid leukemia, we hope. But you also do a lot of work in India, and a lot of it is based on, combining entrepreneurial approaches with helping people elsewhere. So maybe you want to choose whatever you want to talk about, but maybe you want to tell us something about your work, maybe how it connects with people in India and how it might help people elsewhere, and maybe we can end with that.
Great. Well, first of all, Shiv, thank you for inviting me. I'm a big fan of CMC, so I want to congratulate everyone who's either a graduate of the institution or is connected with the institution. You do an enormous public service to India. Um, I'll give you two instances of things we've done. One is that the CAR T one of the things that we've created is that I'm the founder of one of the two companies in India that has made CAR T therapies in India. The one that I founded is called Immunil. It is based in Bangalore. We are actually different from other companies in the sense that we make our own. We have created a fully integrated GMP facility, including we make our own lentivirus in India. So we make an end-to-end production of an autologous therapy in India, and it's priced at, as someone said, at about 1/10 the price of the United States. We're trying to get to 1/20th. And the Gates Foundation recently challenged us and asked us to get to 1/50th of the costs of therapy in India. We have now cured, I use the word cured, we have now cured, I think, about 30 children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia and lymphoma in India. Those patients were treated on trial, so that was all free of cost. That was all done completely free. We have a program that we will soon announce in which we will enable 1 in 5 patients to be treated, again, free of cost, through a program that we have, which we are initiating. So we are bringing novel CAR T programs. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that a large part of our program that we started in India, which has been recognized in multiple abstracts and articles in major publications, is that we don't want to be fast followers. We want to be leaders. So we have a rich pipeline which involves rare diseases, beta thalassemia, sickle cell anemia, and in all cases we issue challenges to ourselves and we follow through with those challenges and create new therapies which actually then come back into the West. In fact, our integrated system for lentivirus CAR T cell production at 1/10 the cost is now being resourced back into the West by funds like ARPA-H, because they're asking the question, why are we paying $500,000 when India can produce the same quality product for $50,000? That's one example of what we do. The second initiative, and then we can stop, and I'm happy to talk more, answer questions, whatever we want to do. But the second initiative has not really been publicly announced. Again, I said I'll do things for fun here. But Gates Ventures, Reid Hoffman, and I are just announcing a new program, which I will take over as the director of, the CEO of. It's a company called Manus, and its mandate is to use AI to discover drugs. So we have written already a whole suite, not just one, but an entire suite of novel programs that use AI to screen 10 billion to 100 billion molecules in silico to find new medicines for various diseases. Obviously, we are interested, given my background in cancer, but we have a major interest and a major initiative ongoing in global diseases, of which I will highlight 2 examples, one of them being sickle cell and beta thalassemia. I think that it's a complete, I would say, it's an impossibility to imagine giving therapies such as Casgevy, which costs $2.2 million or $1.8 million, some absurd number like that. In India, we're actually creating our own variations of that, which we will try to bring down to the order of $20,000 to $50,000, and perhaps even less. And number 2 is we're also focusing on diseases such as drug-resistant tuberculosis, where the molecule responsible for drug resistance now has been identified. We can now model that, and we can now dock in silico 10 to 100 billion ligands or molecules into that, and try to find a new drug against that. And of course, we would love to bring these trials not only to Bangalore, but of course to CMC, which is a preeminent medical center for our concerns. So those are two flavors of the kinds of things that we're doing in the future.
Sid, I think I speak for everybody in this room that we really think it's a privilege to have you here with us and to hear from you. And thank you once again for coming and joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.